Greetings.
Should I put a little more growl into it?
Okay, I came back to, we spent 48 hours making puppets.
Making and breaking hearts, Ellinger.
It's not that kind of podcast.
On a practical level, I have to remember what I was saying on a practical level.
We should have a safe word. Armageddon!
I guess we're maybe semi-proud of that.
Welcome to Hide and Create, your online writing workshop. Welcome back to Hide and Create. This is Joshua Essoe. I'm going to be moderating your show about self-editing. I'm here, of course, with Moses Siregar, Diana Rowland, and Jordan Ellinger. So, I wanted to start with a tiny bit of my own history. I learned to edit from my parents, who were both writers. My mom would red ink the crap out of all my stories as a teenager, and from that I learned how to cut. I'm very good at cutting. What jump-started my learning curve on editing for content and pacing were the notes that Brandon Sanderson gave me on the first 4 or 5 pages of a zombie story that he looked at. One of the things that he wrote on one of the pages at the very top was beautiful writing, and then he put an X through the entire page and also wrote nothing's happening with an exclamation mark. So while I was doing a pretty good job at putting the words down, I was putting the wrong words down. And I wanted to go to you guys and find out what your processes are like when you start self-editing yourself. Jordan?
Okay, so I read On Writing by Stephen King a while ago, and in that book he has advice that says that you should cut 10% from whatever you write out of the first draft, and I found that that doesn't work for me. It works for Stephen King because he just writes all of the things. he's got... he just kind of goes and goes and goes. Me, I write very sparse, right? Like I write towards the ending in this kind of frantic rush, to keep going and keep going and keep going. So I find that I have to fill out my first drafts a fair amount. What I do is, as I'm going along, if there's a scene that's uncomfortable, or if it's just not working for me, or if I'm not inspired by it, the scene that just has to be in the novel, I'll put the words, the 2 letters TK next to it, and then often I'll put notes in all caps. And then what I can do is, because the letters T and K almost never appear next to each other in the English language, I can do
Butt kiss.
Sorry?
Butt kiss. I found that out the hard way.
Okay, so unless you use the word butt kiss, so I mean they almost never occur. So I'll then do a find, and so I'll have a TK note, and then I'll do a find. It'll get to that section of the manuscript, and I'll fill that out, and then I'll do a find and get to the next part and fill that out, and then I'll have a complete basic first draft, and then I'll go through and make sure that it all kind of works well. I'm not, I do use words active passive feature a little bit, just to make sure that my passive versus active voice percentage. I'm not one of these people that will say never use the passive voice. And the passive voice, for those who don't know, is when you use the word to be in the sentence, like instead of the sand. I don't know. Can anybody come?
Well, like here, the door was closed instead of he closed the door.
Yeah.
The door was closed as passive. He closed the door as active.
Passive construction occurs when you make the object of an action into the subject of your sentence. So, whoever or whatever is performing the action is not the grammatical subject of the sentence. For example, the next few hours were consumed with preparations for the journey. Okay, so what's the action in that sentence? The preparations are supposed to be, but the preparations aren't in the spot where you'd expect the grammatical subject to be, right? The hours are. So to make that sentence active, you rearrange it. Preparations for the journey consumed the next few hours.
Perfect. There you go. So, a lesson from our editor. Very well put, Joshua.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I mean, there are reasons that you want to use the passive voice on occasion, right? You want the subject to be mysterious. The passive voice can often very easily skip through large sections of time, right? So there are reasons you want to use it. So I just try to make sure that the percentage is, like, I have like maybe 2% or less passive sentences, right? So I do keep my writing fairly active, but I'm not obsessive about it. Grammar, yeah, sure. Often I'll use words, grammar thing, and then just accept that it's going to be wrong a lot of the time. Most of the time it's going to be wrong, but it does catch things occasionally.
I also have a formula. I just remembered this. There's a formula for spotting passive voice. It's a form of to be plus the past participle. And if you have a form of to be plus the past participle, then you got passive voice. So,
just for people that don't know, what's an example of past participle?
Oh, put me on the spot, why don't you?
Well, you're using all your jargon.
An example of the past participle is the verb thrown in the ball has been thrown. Okay, another one is raised in many hands were raised. Those are both past participles.
Got it.
Okay. So while we're on the subject of passive voice, this is a little, thing that bothers me sometimes. Might as well throw it out there while it's out there. Like we said, passive voice, instead of Bob hit the boy, if you make it passive voice, the boy was hit by Bob, right? Or something like that. But like Jordan said, there are good times to use passive voice. Like he said, leaving the subject more mysterious. Or sometimes you want to emphasize the victim in the sentence. So the subject, which comes at the beginning of the sentence, puts emphasis on that as an important thing. And so it's important that your character was hit by someone, not some random guy that we don't care about hit her. So and it's a good thing to research. Like, look up articles on when you want to use passive voice, because there are plenty of good times to use passive voice and when it's a superior thing to do. But the pet peeve I have is when I get feedback from beta readers often, where people think that anytime you use a to be verb, it's passive voice, and that's not the case. Like, you can use it. You can use a to be verb, and it's not passive voice. Passive voice is what we just explained, and now that that's off my chest, we can go on.
That's one reason I'm not really fond of writing groups per se, especially writing groups where there are a bunch of novice authors, because many of them learn rules like active over passive, and then they apply them obsessively. And I wrote an article about this on the Writers of the Future newsroom, but there's a very, if you want to see an example of this, look up the 1-star reviews on Scott Lynch's The Lies of Locke Remora, because Scott Lynch is a brilliant writer, but he very much bends the rules of writing.
Yep.
And you can see all these amateur authors going on there, and in their reviews saying he breaks this rule, show don't tell, or whatever. Like, it's very kind of pedantic criticism of his books. So
yeah, I personally, I think he's one of the most. Personally, he's my favorite writer out of like current writing science fiction fantasy authors. Like, just his writing style, his creativity, the way he breaks rules. I read him just to see him break rules and do crazy stuff with words. I love, just for me, it's like a joy to read how he does all that stuff. There was a great quote I saw on Facebook recently from Pablo Picasso. It was, "Learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist."
Yeah. Oh, yeah. For sure. Right. I think you reach a certain level of your craft when you realize when you can break the rules. It's good to know them, like you said, so that you don't break them willy-nilly, so that you know the reason that you're breaking those rules. I think that's important, to know why you're breaking the rules.
Yeah, and I think, as the indie author here, this is, of course, you see reviews and comments, and you read badly edited indie books all the time. A lot of indie authors don't splurge for an editor, or they, hire an editor who's not really that good. It's their, their mom, and their mom, edits the bowling newsletter or something like that. So, there's a whole spectrum, and there are very, very well edited indie books. I'd like to think mine is one of them. I hired 3 editors and a proofreader, and then had a whole little army of proofreaders working on the book as well. I think it's pretty hard to find a proofreading error, in my novel, for example. But I remember a thread at the Kindle Board's Writers Cafe where people were saying, "What's your biggest regret?" And the most common thing people said was not hiring editor, or not hiring a good enough editor, or not investing enough money in editing, or some variation on that.
That's very interesting.
and as an indie, you have to do a lot of self-editing. Everyone does, right? Every author has to do their own self-editing. You can't turn in a steaming pile of turd, even if you're with a publishing house. They're not going to just clean everything up for you. You have to write, clean work to begin with.
Well, it depends how big an author you are. I've heard stories about, very, very famous authors turning in horrible manuscripts and people saying, well, we got to publish it. It doesn't matter how bad it is. It'll sell 1 million copies.
Yeah. And then, so they can get away with it because they're where they are. But ideally, even that person could be able to self-edit better, right? Or have some way to do that. So really, as an indie, I think you do want to learn the rules. You want to learn how to self-edit. You need to know as much as you possibly can about grammar and all this stuff, so that you can have something that's good before you even turn it over to an editor. When you're hiring a freelance editor, you can get good recommendations and referrals, but still, how do you know for sure? You might see their editing and you think it's good, but you don't know the things that they're missing sometimes. So it really falls on you to do the absolute best job you can do, unless you're hiring someone who's a really well-established editor who really is going to, do a really thorough job. You got to do the best job possible yourself, and then turn it over to other people. And unfortunately, that takes a lot of time and effort to learn those things. And I know a lot of indies who are very prolific who don't necessarily do that. They don't really necessarily put in the time to learn how to edit their own work, and they do trust their editor to fix those things for them. And their books are not that well edited as a result of that. And they may still do very well because they've written a lot of books and they're telling good stories. But you kind of have to figure out how comfortable you are writing something that's not that well edited, and just knowing you're going to be making money from it versus how much effort you want to put into the craft of the editing.
Diana, you submit all your work to a big house. How does your self-editing process work then?
Pretty much, like what Mos is saying, I turn in as polished as possible because they don't have the time to teach me how to write or make it right. We run on a very tight schedule, so basically, going from what we were talking about in the last episode of the first draft, my self-editing process flows straight from that. My first draft is very rough. I put in square brackets for stuff that I know I'm going to put in later, descriptions, transitions, scenes, entire scenes sometimes. And so the next pass is basically going through and I re-outline. I make sure that the story actually makes sense, that all the pacing is right, the stakes are right. Then I go through again. I start filling in some of the square brackets. I fill in the transitions, the words that aren't right, and maybe some research that I needed to do. When it comes to descriptions, I make sure I'm not just telling what a scene looks like. I also try and include other senses, how it smells, taste, sound, all that kind of stuff. After I go through and fill in the transitions, basically at that point I'm driving for what I call the readable draft. It's still crummy and the prose isn't great, but it's a readable draft. And at that point, my continuity editor, who by the way, the publisher doesn't provide the continuity editor. This is someone that I hire on my own. I give it to her, and she starts going through it, making sure that it makes sense, has continuity within the book itself, and also has continuity with the previous books. Names, situations, dates, pretty much everything. Then I start giving it over to beta readers. And I don't see how anyone can write without getting feedback. I just don't think it's possible at all. So I have several beta readers, and I do them in stages. There's a couple who get the first readable draft, essentially. I get their feedback, rewrite again. I send it on to the next stage of beta readers, and then finally I'll send it on to my agent's assistant, Lindsay, and she pretty much gives me the last pass from there. And once I'm absolutely sure that I've done as much as I possibly can to it, and then it's nice and polished and as perfect as I can make it, then I send it in and I give it to my editor.
Diana, how did you find your beta readers?
Through a bit of trial and error. I don't have all that many. My Lindsay, my agent's assistant, she's one. A friend of hers has been one before. Nicole Peeler, she's also an urban fantasy author. She and I were critique partners for quite some time. Mary Robinette Cole is a beta reader from my Demon series. It's mostly people who I trust who can give me good feedback. They don't always have to be writers. In fact, I try not to have them all be writers. I think it's good to get a feedback from a reader too. And basically, I just kind of trial and error. I don't have scored scads and scads, just because that's a lot of feedback to get through. But I do try and have enough where if everyone kind of sees the same thing, then yeah, I know it's a problem. We were talking earlier about like writing rules, like the passive voice and that sort of thing. And there's a couple that I think are good, but I think that amateur writers tend to get caught up on, like the kill your darlings. That one kind of drives me crazy because I think it gets really misinterpreted. I've heard people say kill your darlings, which means go through your manuscript and anything that you're really in love with, cut. It's like, well, no.
Yep.
No. The entire phrase should be, you should be willing to kill your darlings. Yep. Where if you're going through your manuscript and there's a scene that you absolutely love, but it just doesn't work in the book, you might have to kill it. And that's when you put it in a very special file and hope that you can save it for another book someday.
Exactly.
Or something like that. And the show don't tell. No, you know what? Sometimes you do have to show. Daniel Abraham said it best. He said, show don't tell is a beginner strategy. Dramatize when it's time to dramatize. Summarize when it's time to summarize. Knowing the difference is the job description. So that's pretty much my standard practice for editing. I know that there are some authors who turn in roughish drafts to their editors, and I don't see how they can do it. Because I know that my editor's swamped. She doesn't have time to go through and do all the edits that I should be able to do on my own. And I want as much good feedback from her as possible, so why should I waste her time on stuff that I can fix on my own? That way, once it's sent to her, I get the stuff that she really can dig into, and with all of her skills, she can say, you know, I don't like this part where you did this because it doesn't flow into this. I'm like, oh, that's fantastic. So I love my editor.
Yeah, I do want to recommend a book. You probably, if you're listening to this podcast, you've probably either read this book already, or you probably have it sitting on a shelf, or your Kindle or your iPad. But Self-Editing for Fiction Writers by Brown and King. Brown has an E at the end of it. That's one of the classic recommended books for self-editing. And if you do not have that book and you're a writer, please go get it right now and check it out. It covers all sorts of great topics. It's just a great education.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about just experience with editing and being an indie author. I mean, I just turned in my 8th book, and I still would never want to publish a book without a professional going through it and editing it. I mean, I think I know what I'm doing now, and I'm pretty good, and I have a good support system. But still, you just need a professional set of eyes on that book to get that final polish on. I really believe that.
Yeah, I agree. I know one indie author who does well. She actually does edit herself. There are some good computer programs that will check your grammar and go through and find possible errors in grammar and so on. Some of those are actually pretty good, and she goes through, does that, and produces a pretty well edited book. But I agree with you. If you
that to me, that's the copy editor.
Well, I agree with you. If you want a top level product, do everything you can do on your own, get it as good as you can get it, and then get it to someone who really knows what they're doing, and then go back over it again.
Yeah, see, my editor doesn't do the copy editing. That's someone completely different. My editor is the one who goes through and works on the story, who says, this doesn't work with this, and you need to bunch up the scene, that sort of stuff. Then the copy editor goes through it. And she also works on, a good copy editor will also do continuity with the style sheet for the series and within the book itself. I just know that it's not fair to expect a copy editor to have to keep track of 6 books prior in the series, and it's just easier for me while I'm writing it to have a continuity editor of my own.
Yeah.
I know a lot of authors who do. So.
I think this author I'm thinking of, she does have beta readers that she uses. I think if you have enough beta readers, or you have good enough beta readers, you can get a lot of your content editing that way. Like people who say, the beginning doesn't work and it needs to go like this. I mean, yeah, ideally you have someone, who really, really knows their stuff and has been doing it for a long time. But if you have really good beta readers, they can help you fix, the basic content issues.
Right.
So I don't know.
Yeah, I'd like to note that it's worthwhile to revisit, speaking of beginnings, it's worthwhile to revisit your beginning after you have completely finished the book, after you've written the end. Perhaps it's even worthwhile throwing away and rewriting your opening completely, because after you know where your story goes, you have a much clearer idea of where to begin.
I do that, actually.
I was going to ask you, what happens with you, Jordan, in your process, and what do they do to you over at Black Library?
Well, I realized that, rereading some of my old stuff, I get into this thing where I just kind of feel around until I find the start of a story, and then I go. And the first part just is feeling around and it doesn't work, right? So I always try to cut the first part of everything that I do. I was rereading Ritual of Fire, which is that novel that I was talking about earlier, and the first chapter I think is fairly well written, but it doesn't sing the way that chapter 2 and chapter 3 and chapter 4 sings, right? So generally I just try to cut as much as I can off the start of whatever I'm doing and get to that point where it was flowing, etc., right? And then that'll just kind of bring the reader in. So
I also think it's useful if you have the time to, once you finish it and done what you think you've done with it, to put it aside for a few weeks. Now, I don't really get that luxury anymore because I'm doing 2 books a year, but it kind of works because after I turn it in, I get a couple of weeks before I get edits back, and then I get a few weeks more before I get copy edits back, and then usually it's about a month before I get my proofs back. So in those spaces, I'm usually working on another project, so I can clear my head, and when I get the copy edits back or I get the proofs back, it's fresh, and I can go through and go, oh wow, boy, this needs fixing here, and they never had this conversation they were supposed to have, and it's able to fix those things. With my first book, Mark of the Demon, I actually put it aside for 3 months before I went back and edited it. This was before I had a contract or anything, and I think it was very useful to look at it with very fresh eyes.
Yeah, about tie-in writing, Joshua. Sorry, I kind of missed that part of the question.
I was figuring out how to work back over to that.
Yeah, sorry, about editing. I mean, I'll turn something in, they'll edit, they'll send it back to me, I'll do changes, and then often they'll send me a final draft or something, but then things can change after that, right? Like in tie-in writing, you don't own that. It's work for hire. You don't own that copyright. So sometimes I'll have a completely different title even, right? Like I submitted this one story, and it was called something like the drinking contest or something like that, right? And then my editor suggested As a Skunk, and I drunk as a skunk, and so okay, fine. I was like, sure, whatever. I don't, it's a flash fiction story. I figure he knows the market well. As a Skunk works. And then it came out, and it was just The Contest after that. So I didn't even know it had really come out because the title had been changed.
Wow.
And they had some insult that they wanted their character to say, you Frugler or something like that. I don't even know what it was. It was kind of like a made-up thing. And so they suggested that in the edit that came back to me, and I was like, wow, no, that's a horrible insult. I'm not using that. So I just pretended like I forgot to make that change and resubmitted it, and lo and behold, that insult was in my final manuscript, right? So you have to be
congratulations.
Yeah, you have to be you have to be fairly divorce yourself. You can't be precious about your fiction as a tie-in writer, right? I mean, I've gotten reviews of stories, right? I got a very recent review that I don't want to talk about. I'm not going to name specifically what the review was, but the review was, this is amazing except for this part which is really weak, right? The way this character talked was really weak. And I was like, oh my god, the editor made me change that, I didn't do that, right? The editor was like, you should make him talk this way, right? Now, so you gotta let it be like water off a duck's back with tie-in writing. It's work for hire. Don't be precious about it. Just give them what they want. Earn your paycheck. Be a little bit mercenary about it, and realize that somebody else is paying you to improve as a writer. They say that you need to get your 1,000,000 words out. I'm being paid to get my 1,000,000 words out. So
we're a couple minutes over time now, but we're getting into some really interesting information. I'd like to go for just a couple more minutes. I want to ask you guys if you're aware of any personal tics that you've got, because as an editor that I do it every single day, I see the personal tics come out in writing constantly, words or phrases that for one reason or another the author just falls in love with and uses over and over and over throughout the story. I often ask them to go back through and eliminate all of them. Very common ones are turning toward, shaking their heads, smiling, couldn't help but, suddenly doing things, and tagging everything with said. What about you guys? Do you have personal tics that you're aware of?
Just. Oh my God, I love the word just. Just. And I was told that in my last book, I really loved another word that I can't say here. And I've actually gotten to where I will go through and do a search once I'm finished, looking for just and for certain bad words, and I go back and I pair them out. I also apparently really like grimaced. Grimaced.
Everybody's grimacing.
Yeah. McDonald's character.
Yeah.
The big purple blob.
Yeah, I'm more aware of the just thing now. In fact, sometimes I avoid it to excess, and I have to go back and actually force myself to put in the word just because that's the right word. But yeah, that's my word.
Funny. Moses?
I can't think of any. Maybe seam or seams. That's kind of a weak word. I think I use that a little too much. I was going to say Cliche Cleaner, I think, is a free program you can get off the web. And you can go through and it'll find repetitive phrases. It'll help you find your repetitive phrases and words. That can be a good way to realize what you're doing, because a lot of times you don't realize it until someone points it out. And before we finish, I had a few other notes just on some specific things I've noticed when I self-edit that I try to fix. But
okay,
can you do that in closing thoughts? Because I wanted
Sure.
to get my that. So my tick is, like you mentioned, suddenly, right? Like I use suddenly a fair amount, and a good friend of mine once said that using the word suddenly makes it so that whatever follows that word is less sudden.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yep.
So, try not to use suddenly. I take out nearly all of the suddenlies, and it works, right? Because as you're reading, instead of suddenly, you have whatever it is that occurs, suddenly. If you remove that word, you remove the buffer that the reader gets before they go into that next action, and then that action without the buffer seems more immediate.
Yes.
Suddenly, nothing happened.
Yeah, I think when suddenly is at the beginning of a sentence in particular, that's the one that's almost always not necessary.
Yeah.
Sometimes in the middle of a sentence, it is useful, but it depends on the situation.
Moses, you had a thought that you wanted to...
Yeah, I just try to think of like self-editing things that I tend to notice like on a line-by-line level when I go back and edit. Just a few things that I notice this in my work. Maybe some of you guys will notice it, in your work for our listeners. But one thing I learned from one of my editors was the start of your paragraph. Look at the word you use at the start of your paragraph. You don't want to have paragraph after paragraph starting the same way.
Yes.
But that's really important in first person too. You got to look at and make sure that every paragraph doesn't start with I.
Yep.
I. Yeah.
Yeah. Or Bob, whatever it is. Another one that I try to really pay attention to is making sure my pronouns are clear, who they refer to. Early on, I had a lot of confusing pronouns, and a lot of times if you go in, just look at the pronoun, make sure it is absolutely clear who it refers to. If not, use the proper noun or name the noun of what it is, because there's no point in using it if the reader is going to be confused by who you're talking about. And generally, the pronoun is going to refer to the last thing named. Like if you're using he, it's going to refer to the last character that you named. That's another thing to keep in mind. But anyway, pay attention to your pronouns. You can go through and look at every adjective and adverb in your book and ask yourself if it needs to be there or not. And some of them are great, and some of them are not necessary. Some of them are just too much. So that's another thing you can always go through and look at. And I'm not sure what the technical term is here, but sometimes I'll write sentences where there's a subject confusion going on, where the sentence isn't written properly, where the subject isn't agreeing with what's coming after. And anyway, that's another one that is subtler, but you can catch those too.
About adverbs, one of my favorite quotes is by Stephen King, and he said, "The road to hell is paved with adverbs, and I'll shout it from the mountaintops."
I love adverbs.
Yeah, and that's the learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. There are times where an adverb is absolutely does the job, and there are a lot of times where they're just not really adding to your fiction. They're just watering it down too much.
Yeah, so cut. I recently marked in a manuscript that I was working on. I recently marked a string of I think it was out of 12 sentences, 9 of them began with he. So that's something. Yeah, that's something that you want to watch out for. Watch out for the rhythm of your sentence. Too many long sentences one after another, or too many short ones one after another. Vary that length.
Read your stuff out loud if you can.
Yeah, read your stuff out loud. Use that length to imply the mood and the tone that you want to create. If you want something relaxed, longer might be better. Action and tension is great with shorter sentences. Sometimes a staccato of a bunch of short sentences is exactly the right tool that you want to use to sculpt unease in your readers. But I think that we are definitely over time here. I want to wrap up with some final thoughts. Diana.
Yes. Final thoughts. Do what works for you. Don't be afraid to ask for people to read your stuff. Take their advice. Use beta readers. If you write long, you may need to cut. If you write short, you're probably going to have to expand. Read your stuff aloud. There you go.
Moses?
Self-editing. Do it.
Jordan?
Writing is rewriting. Done.
Yes. Stress over all the things that your grammar teacher in grade school wrapped your knuckles for. Ending your sentence in a preposition, or split infinitives, or starting your sentence with or but, or and. All of those things can be used to really great effect. Just make sure you know the rules before you start breaking them all over the place. Okay, that wraps up our show on self-editing for now. Come back next week and we'll have another great show for you.
This has been another episode of Hide and Create. The show is produced by me, Jordan Ellinger. The site is edited by Joshua Essoe, and your co-hosts have been Diana Rowland and Moses Siregar. That music that you're listening to was written by Jason Donnelly. We can be reached at writingpodcastonline.com, where you can ask us questions and suggest topics for future shows. Thank you for listening. Now go hide and create something.